So, so we're going to talk about uh, theory of knowledge. So from the meetup page, we will discuss Spinoza, the theory of knowledge, and to scope out today's discussion. Actually, we're going to focus on adequate knowledge because last week we discussed the inadequate knowledge. So we're going to focus on what he meant by adequate knowledge. And just to have a bit of a structure on that, P32 talks about intuitive ideas related to God, and 34 talks about simple ideas, and 37 to 40 talks about common notions, and these are new concepts from Spinoza. And then the common notions, the logical derivatives. And then obviously they are missing propositions 33, 35, 36. And these are a detour on the idea or the concept of falsity. Okay, now, so just actually before we started, Blake had a nice illustration of the three kinds of knowledge. But anyway, I prepared this, so I will just show you as a prelude to 2 weeks later, and as a good introduction to today's discussion. Knowledge of the first kind are opinions and imagination, so they are inadequate, according to Spinoza, and these are the stuff we discussed last week. So they could come through the senses, and of course, senses are deceptive. We all know the example of bended stick in water, and from signs, such as we heard about something, we read about something. I never traveled to Australia, but I heard about Australia, and I presume they are true. But these are the things that I did not experience myself, so they are first kind of knowledge for me. The second kind are reasons, and these are the ones we're going to focus today. And Spinoza thinks they are adequate, and he has broken down a category of a classification of this second type. Some are simple ideas. We'll go through the meanings of them later. And some are common notions, and then the common notions are logical derivatives. And then the third one, the intuitive knowledge. And the intuitive knowledge, according to Spinoza, is also adequate. And so I find that, Blake's example about riding a bike being intuitive, that's very, very good to capture the essence. But Spinoza also has some thinking that related to the ideas of God proceeds from an adequate idea of the formal essence of certain attributes of God to the adequate knowledge of the essence of thing. So this is a very intriguing. Why we intuitively know how to ride a bike? Well, Spinoza thinks that's because we intuitively know the essence of the attribute of God, especially the attribute of thought of God. And that's a connection. It's kind of very intriguing idea. It's not easy to grasp at first or agree to, but that's his idea. Okay, so these are the structure, and it will help us to keep track of different concepts as we move forward. All right, so do interrupt me, so we make this more interactive. All right, so okay, with that preambles, let's dive into details. So I'm going to for this week to change the order of the presentation from the order of the propositions in the text, because I find the flow is a bit cumbersome according to the strict the geometrical order of the propositions. So I'm going to present a flow, order of flow that makes sense to me. Hopefully it will also easier for me to communicate to you on Spinoza's ideas in this part of the text. Okay, so I'm going to first focus on common notions because I find this new, the nuance. Yeah, the other intuitive, simple ideas we can talk about it, but it's not new.
Sorry to
So to focus on this, at least in relative terms, the common notion, what does he mean by that? And that's proposition 37 to 40. So what is a common notion? Right? So what is a common notion by Spinoza's definition? All right, so he actually kind of defined it in the Scholim 1 of proposition 40. It's quite like in the end of this whole discussion. And he says he did not actually precisely define it, but kind of make allusion to it. With this, it's very unclear what's with this, but anyway, I have explained the cause of those notions which are called common, and which are the foundations of our reasoning, ratiocinate. So it's very important for him. That's this concept of common notions. Now, what does he mean? All right. So in the old scholastic medieval expositions of the topics before him, there is actually a key concept, axiom. And the axioms actually was presented or written as notions, axiomatum, as axiom, sieve, or notion. And in the Euclidean elements, that was the very first source. Axiom, of course, we all know the axioms and the importance of it in the Euclidean framework system. There is common notions, and in the Greek, koinai and nainoi. So that was the first source. And then in the Arabic and Hebrew translations of the Greek text, it was also referred to as first notion or known notion. And the Latin translation, it gets closer, communis animi conceptionis. So that gets closer to common notion or common conceptions. Yes, Courtney.
Can we say that these are notions which are common to, like notions which are common to humans, notions which are common to animals, notions which are common to birds, you know, like no common to, would that narrow it down?
Yes, that's a very good question. I'm just trying to think how best to address that. Let me finish this page. I'll come right back. But it's a very good question. And then Descartes also used this axiom or common notion axiomata, communis notionis. So this is getting very close to equate common notions to axiom. Now, Since you asked Courtney, let me actually jump to the very end of the presentation, which I was planning to just make a remark at the end of the presentation, but now since you raised the question, so it's really how do we understand common? Okay, so another concept, universals, of course, is very common in the philosophical tradition. So if we make a contrast with that, we might get a better sense of what he meant by common, or what the philosophers before Spinoza meant by common. Common to what? Okay. Oh, I think I'm one page earlier. Okay, so there's a bit of jumping here, but to be flexible to address the question. So common notions, well, okay, that's a conclusion eventually. Common notions are adequate, universals are inadequate, but let's dive into the details, what makes the difference of the two concepts in order to understand better the connotation of common. So when we talk about universals, right, universal common, well, these sound very similar. But the notions that are called universal, this is from the Scholium 1 of the P40, like man, I think he meant manhood, horse, like a horsehood, dog, doghood, etc. How
I
about
think
rising
actually,
from?
I think Nick, he really just does mean concrete universals, like dog. At least that was my reading, rather than an abstract universal like goodness. But he talks about transcendentals as well as a particular type of universal. Those are the abstract universals. He mentions thing, for example, as an abstract universal. But when he gives the example man and dog, I do believe that he is looking at the concrete things. That's my reading at any rate.
No,
Rather
that's
than
very interesting reading.
rather than an abstraction like human nature. I mean that was certainly a big issue in medieval theology, whether human nature was a thing, an abstract universal, because the sort of the doctrine of original sin doesn't in Christianity, it makes no sense at all unless there is a universal human nature which is common to all people. But in that
Yeah,
case,
yeah.
Spinoza really does seem to me to be talking about concrete universals like horse and dog, rather than the property of a horse nature or a dog nature. So it seems to me. But let
Yeah,
me let me go ahead, Nick. I shouldn't have interrupted you at
no,
this
no,
point.
no. These are
Yeah.
very important concepts. So it actually the better to pause and the voice out different interpretations. Yes, Courtney.
So the interpretation where Spinoza may not be talking about human nature per se, as it relates to human behavior. This is so that would to me would be something that is relative and subject to at least change, if not mistaken concepts. If I was to
Yep.
say, this is human nature, how that would be, would that be inadequate to say that, to make a statement like that? This is human nature.
Well, if you think of Plato, I mean, who is probably the best example, we are probably all familiar with Platonic forms, and he has Platonic form, he has universals. The forms are universals for everything that you can think of. I mean, justice or virtue, the good, the beautiful, and there's also a universal form of man for Plato. There's a universal for everything that can be attributed to an innumerable number of individuals, or a quality that it can be applied to any object you can think of. So, you know, Nick, when you say these notions they call universal, like man, horse, and dog, Spinoza actually is saying that there is something quite apart from all the individuals that make up individual human beings. There is a form, and it is the form of man. That's what he means by universal. Same with dogs and horses and everything else.
Yeah, great. So you heard two interpretations, right? I'm closer to Robert in the sense that maybe Patrick, what I heard from you is that you are reading this as particulars, but I and Robert are reading this as genus in Aristotelian framework. That universal refers to the high, sort of the genus, or the form of Plato. But let's suspend that debate. Let's go to the end and see if we can make sense of this. And I'll mark up, Courtney, your question on relativity, because that's really the one of the key point at the end of this 2 pages. I mean, relative valuation, relativity of the judgment, etc. All right. So, well, at least that's what from the text that what Spinoza seems to suggest. A unique feature of what he called universal, but obviously, you know, this is not the feature of common notion, because common notion, we'll cover that when we get back, come out of the human intellect, not imagination. But here he's clearly saying that we imagine either the form of the man or the particular man. Okay, so now second difference of these two concepts are that for the universals, the images distinctly only what they all agree in. Okay, so it took me a bit while to understand what this means. It's still a bit fuzzy, but he basically is saying, to me, that the concept of universal is narrower than the common notion, because you need a conditional clause. Somehow, some the have to agree in, while the common notions applies to all in that sense. So common notion is more universal than universals. Why is that? Because he thought, you know, we form the notion or the concept of universal insofar as they affect the body. So of course, if you have no effect on the body, you wouldn't imagine the universal. I find this idea, this second difference a bit hard to grasp, but let me move on to the third one. The third one really addressed the question of relativity. And these universals are not formed by all in the same way, but vary from one to another in accordance with what the body has more often been affected by and what the mind imagines or recollects more easily. So this is really the point on relativity. What I see of this room meeting is very different from what Courtney you see of this room meeting, even though we may overlap 99.9% of the features, but there could still be slight differences. So I think that's what he meant. But this is not applicable to the concept of common notions. Common notions, common. So there, you might get a bit of a sense of what he meant by common. So obviously this has implications. So let me just go through it. And he gave examples very nicely to illustrate the third point, especially. Those who have more often regarded men. So here he's thinking about the man. So what is the universal man? Those, that means people, you and I, who have more often regarded man's stature with wonder, will understand by the word man an animal of erect stature. So if we think the way in the term of stature, we might think the concept or the form of man as an animal of erect stature. But those who have been accustomed to consider something else will form another common image of man. For example, a man is an animal capable of laughter, or a featherless biped, or a rational animal. So depending on your own personal preference or disposition or understanding, you might conceptualize the manhood or the form of man in different way, slight different way. And similarly concerning the others, so, more than just man, anything you can think of, each will form universal images of things according to the disposition of his body. So this really says universal as a concept is not very universal. And I find this very interesting. Hence, it's not surprising that so many controversies have arisen among philosophers who have wished to explain natural things by mere images of things. Okay, so this makes it very clear to me that he was thinking about universals as some sort of abstract notion, like the Platonic form or the Aristotelian genus. And then he's saying they are relative, depending on who is thinking about it. And therefore they are inadequate. That's his major conclusion. But the reason we got here is because Courtney is questioning on what is meant by common. But after this, I hope we have a better understanding of his meaning of common notions versus other meanings of universal / common. Yeah. So Courtney, was that adequate to address your concern?
Yes, it was. I really look at Spinoza. I try to keep a very open mind with Spinoza because I know his language and his affect, if you will, like his I don't want to say presence. That just sounds too wooey, but his style, that's better. His style is a little bit hard for me to understand sometimes.
That's very true. That's very true. Sometimes the language he uses, and in the translation that we're looking at, sometimes the syntax, even the syntax alone, makes it very difficult to understand a very simple idea. Go ahead, Chris.
So I was wondering if can something go from being in a state of common? I guess if you have 3 different cultures and they all agree right now about what we call something like what peace is or what human is, and then a 4th culture come up and all of a sudden it's not common anymore. Like, where does it go? Can it go from universal to common based on the instances in the current world?
Actually, I think that we're going to discover that common notions doesn't depend on anything relative at all. Like, I'm going to let Nick deal with this, but There's a big difference between, you see, when Spinoza's talking about universals, basically, just a very simple way of putting it, because I don't want to hold up the Nick's presentation, but a very simple way of putting it is to say that we experience things and they have effects on our body, right? And on the basis of those effects, innumerable experiences of another human being, and will form for ourselves a universal notion of what a human being is. But that's contingent on the people that we meet and who we are, right? Depending on how the nature of our body, how it's affected by the innumerable human being, the numberless human beings that we meet, we eventually generalize because of all these effects pile up in such a way that the human mind, in a sense, the imagination, cannot sort of culminate all of them accurately and precisely into something like a clear and precise idea of what it is to be human. So what happens is it becomes generalized, right? But it's always from a personal perspective, and it's always random. Some people meet, some people never leave their little village in Botswana or something like that, and that's their idea of human. You know what I mean? Other people have met, all kinds of a wide variety of different human beings, and so they have a different notion of what human being in general is, right? The universal notion of human being. But in any case, the most important point is that Spinoza doesn't believe anything can be well grounded on empirical experience, effects of the body, and the ideas that represent those effects, because they're just completely inadequate, so there. That's all I can say on that point.
But it sounds then like he's promoting the common over the universal. Wouldn't the universal be more the abstraction, while the common is the empirical, the instances?
No, common notions are different from universals altogether. Universals are not they're not related in their origin or anything else. But I think that Nick is going to deal with this. Common notions don't depend on effects. Universals ultimately derive from a culmination, a confused concept that is based on individual effects felt by an individual. You know what I mean? And sense experience in Spinoza is useless anyway for anything like a rational understanding of anything. And the pretense is, of course, for those who entertain the notion of universals, is that they're a rational form, right? But common notions are something much more valid, shall I say? Okay, we'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. So that's a very interesting question, Chris. But it just I'm extending myself a little beyond my understanding of this fundamental issue, which is that throughout the medieval time, for hundreds of years, there were two schools of thought debating among themselves. One is the nominalist versus the realist debate on universals. And the nominalist would say, well, there's actually not the independently existence of universals. They are just, kind of a handy instrument for us to talk about stuff. But the realist school would say, yeah, they're actually universals floating out there like forms or whatever. So they have this huge debate back and forth. And I think, maybe Perry can correct me, I think Spinoza was closer to the camps of nominalist, and his pushback against the universals is this notion of common notion. He wants to go a bit deeper, more fundamental than the conceptualization of universal, and say, look, what do you mean by universal? You just point out those common features. But if you really want to have a theory of knowledge, you ought to go deeper, have more fundamental foundational stone. And these are actually common notions, he would say. So that would be my interpretation of it. But let's move on to see what he really meant in details. So as we, I guess, 15 minutes ago, we covered all those. No, we covered the axiom. We are just basically saying that common notions are basically axioms, a few most fundamental starting points, the Greek idea of starting point. And from there, then he developed his theory of knowledge. All right, so let's have an axiomatic reading of those three propositions. With that, the setup of his. 37 says, what is common to all things? Oh, there, common notions there. Does not constitute the essence of any singular thing, singular. Those things which are common, okay, common notions, can only be conceived adequately. So that's a judgment. That's an important statement. He's predicating. He's saying, well, if we are talking about common notions, they are adequate. Then the next one says, well, if we are talking about common notions, not only with respect to our own body, but a lot of external bodies, and then that idea is also adequate. So basically, he's saying common notions are adequate in different circumstances, and they don't cover singular individual things. So it's a quote unquote universal concept. All right, and here I wanted to, yeah.
Before you go on, Nick, I just make 2 points. Well, first, Wolfson tries to narrow the idea of common notion down to the postulates of Spinoza's physics. I don't know how you responded to that in reading his commentary. It seemed to me to be a bit too restrictive, but he does try to mount an argument to that effect. That was one point, and the other point I'd like to draw attention to proposition 37, where he says that what is common to all things does not constitute the essence of any singular thing. He seems to be saying that the essence of a singular thing is not accessible through common notions. Common notions can only access the properties which things have in common with other things, but not which distinguish particular things. And he really does seem to be making a deliberate contrast here with the definition of intuitive knowledge. Remember, you put that up at the beginning, where he talks about proceeding from a knowledge of God to the essence of singular things. So I think he is here trying to draw a boundary between knowledge of the second kind and knowledge of the third kind. I just want to point that out now, because in 2 weeks' time we'll, I think, need to look at this maybe again when he sets up the contrast between second and third type of knowledge. So go ahead, Nick. I didn't mean to interrupt your flow.
No, that was a very good comment. So if I could just briefly respond, the last one first. This P37 in reference to singular thing. Shirley's translation actually is more readable. Shirley says any one particular thing.
That's right, and so does Elwes. Yeah.
Okay, so that makes it very clear that he's contrasting particular things with quote unquote universal type of concept like common notion. Therefore, yeah, I would say if you want to describe that situation as inaccessible, yeah, they are segregated, so in the sense of the different scope of application. Yeah, so he wouldn't want us to misapply the common notion to describe particular things. The first comment is a bit technical, but Courtney, do you want to jump in here?
Could we say that pain is a universal notion, but hurt is a common one? By that I mean, like, pain, you could describe pain, what pain would be, one thing for one person, another thing for another person. You can't really narrow it down, but if you see something get hurt, it's pretty obvious.
Well, I don't know the answer, Courtney, but an interesting thought. But here I would make two comments. Number one, if we interpret his notion of common notion axiomatically, then we may want to separate the very concept of common notion from the application of that concept to lots of situations, and the one situation being what you described. The other comment I have is this triggers another thought in me, which may be a tangent to this discussion. I also attended another meetup on Wittgenstein, and the discussion of Wittgenstein's last work on certainty. How can we be certain if we know something is true? And of course, Wittgenstein was reacting to G.E. Moore, who basically said, look, this is one of my hand, there's another hand, therefore I have a hand. Common sense defense of the philosophical proof of the existence of our external world, which Kant thought was scandalous for philosophy, never being able to prove it. But there, G.E. Moore actually used the case of pain as a defense of his position. He's basically saying, I can feel my toothache if I have one, but you, Courtney, can never feel it, even though I think it's as real as a tree outside the window. But you will never be able to feel that pain in my tooth. But you could see the same tree I see. They are both in the physical world, but my pain in my tooth is physical, but you will never be able to. So there's a lot of convoluted discussion thereafter. But since you mentioned this case, I would just say I'm not adequate in sort of pursuing the discussion on that, but I would just say, for the sake of reading Spinoza, I will keep it separate. One is his common notion, and the other is application of that axiomatic framework to different situations in reality.
Okay, if I may quickly just respond a little bit to Courtney's point, when you talk about pain and hurt and things like that, these are effects that you feel as an individual, right? Whether you feel pain or you're hurt, or maybe there is a sort of I don't even want to. I just don't think it's just too strange an example to talk about pain and hurt. But if you talk about common notions, really what Spinoza is talking about is things that are intuitively necessarily true. You just simply understand that these things are true, and they have a rational ground, right? So for example, if you talk about a body, you can say, if it's a body, then it occupies space, right? Now, nobody has to explain that to you. You don't have to be taught that. It's like innate knowledge, like everyone understands that a body, generally understood, any ordinary singular object, occupies space, right? That's a general notion, and that's a common notion, I should say. But it certainly, you see, the thing about common notions is that it is universally understood because it's rational, let me just put it in those terms, just for the sake of the conversation at this point. I don't want to, there are all kinds of problems with these things, but just to distinguish it from anything that has to do with a personal effect of any kind. Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Just to take stock quickly, since we're on this before continuing. So it seems like the common notions, I mean, you just called them innate, I think. Did you use that?
No, I don't
Innate?
really want to get into that. Sorry, Alex.
Oh, okay,
It's
no
like
problem.
an axiom. It's like an axiom. When you look at Euclid's geometry, he'll say there's some things that I'm going to posit as part of my proof, but I'm not going to prove it. I'm not going to prove an axiom. You don't prove an axiom because it's just like, if you deny that, then you really, are not a rational creature or something, because it's just quite obviously true. And in a sense, it's impossible to demonstrate the truth of them, because they're just, it's something simple like, a circle that is larger than another circle cannot fit in the first circle, right? You know what I mean? Like an object has to be smaller than another object in order to fit inside that object. So just things like that,
Well, it seems like the kind of things that, like, all the rest of our thinking kind of depends on them. Like,
yeah.
you
You wouldn't even say that they're irrational. It would be something like the identity principle. The identity principle, like
what's
A
interesting
is equal to A, and that's all there is to it.
Right. Yeah. What's interesting to me is the distinction between, I guess, two kinds of generality. Like we have these common notions, but then we have the universals. And it doesn't seem like Spinoza has a very high opinion of universals. Like he seems to be saying they're just derivative of sense experience, and they have this relativity built into them. Whereas the common notions, I mean, they're common, but seemingly in a different way, maybe more truly actually universal. And then as we discussed, the intuitive knowledge would have something to do with singularity, with maybe just the something as an individual, or so just taking a bit of stock here. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, and I should say that Spinoza only apparently denies universals altogether. Go ahead, Chris.
So this reminds me a lot about Willard Quine. I don't know if you're familiar with Quine, but when he's talking about that there is no significant difference between a definition and a fact. So if you say that the earth is round, there is, or like you look at the sun and you then say the sun is round, that are you defining round and saying, look there, that's what I mean by round? Or are you making a statement about reality, that the earth fit that roundness? And he's saying that you're doing the same thing at the same time, because you have definitions, and your definitions, I guess, are the axioms that then validate instances in the world and say, okay, the sun is round, that is true, because you define round that way. And you can always choose to change the definition or to change the thing that fits your definition, or deny it and say the earth is not round because it has mountains. So then you can say round, is it precisely round, or is it like approximately round? And you have to decide which one you're doing. Are you denying this fact, or are you changing the definition? And do you think Spinoza is doing a similar thing when he's talking about the common, or those definitions that we use?
What you've just described, what you've just described is all applies to universals, but it doesn't apply to common notions. Common notions are true of necessity. They're just, we know they're true. If you're human and if you're a rational being, then you just know it's true. It's a universal truth, and it's also a truth of necessity. It's just undeniably true. That's what a common notion is, but not what you just described. You just gave a very good outline of how universals are formed.
Because I think from from Plato's perspective, I think they are formed the way you're thinking about it. But from Quine's perspective, I don't think he would deny universals the way that Spinoza is denying them. He's just critiquing universals the same way as Quine is, where you're saying that, okay, whether you point to all of those things and say they're all round, that's not really the profound things, because the profound thing is the verification with physical reality, where these definition turns into fact in experiment and in real life. And that's, I think, is what Spinoza maybe is saying as well, that it only matters as far as it play out somewhere in reality. Just making universal in an abstract sense is useless, because language is always connected to the physical thing.
Well, Spinoza's concern is that throughout the history of philosophy, but especially during the scholastic period, I don't know why the poor scholastics, I seem to pick on them a lot, but universals were treated as real beings, you know, like there was an actual universal form of a dog somewhere in the world. And you know, when more seriously, if you say, like, let's talk about the universal form of a man, and it has to have these properties, and you know, it has a certain kind of essence, and certain things follow from the essence of the universal form of man. And Spinoza was just saying, where is this universal form of man? What are you talking about when you're talking about a universal form of man? It doesn't actually have being in the world. It's not an actual thing, right? It's, as you said, involves definitions, language, a whole variety of other things. And Spinoza just doesn't believe that they have anything like a rational foundation, the notion of universal beings. And so he doesn't want to use them in his logic. That's all.
No, so round in my example with the sun or the earth, round is a common. It's not a universal. While Plato would say round is a universal form, while Spinoza is arguing, no, it's not. It's just an axiom that we use to then talk about the world.
Not an axiom, not an axiom.
A common
An
thing
axiom and a common notion are necessarily true. A universal is something that's just created by us, so we can deal with the multiplicity of circles that appear in the world. You know, everywhere we look, there's another circle, you know, so after a while, instead of just pointing out singular circles, you say, it's a circle. You know, we just use the word and we mix that up with an actual being, you know. For Plato, there would have to be the form of the circle, you know, and it's just I think that's important, that we understand that axioms and common notions they have a rational ground for, and universal notions are universals in general are just something that we create for the sake of efficiency in our dealings with the world, you know, of phenomena. All of a sudden, I'm beginning to sound a little pretentious. Let's just let Nick continue now.
Yeah, thanks. So that was a good exchange. I don't think we're going to resolve this in one meetup. It is the fundamental issue. We'll mark it up as we move along. But if I may get back to the very first comment that Patrick made, it's a bit technical, but fundamental. But I will just make a quick reference to the Curley text, footnote 62. And he has a very, very interesting discussion about the pushback against Wolfson from this fellow Guer-Roth, who seems to be cited a lot by Curley. So basically, there are two interpretations about some key phrases, key words in the Spinoza's text, which implies a very different reading of the formulation of the common notion and the relation to what he later called the common notions logical derivatives, or the logical implications. I will cover that part, but the specific comment by Patrick you made a bit beyond me. It's deep in the weeds.
Indeed.
All can,
I agree.
all
I
can say
agree.
that,
Yeah.
but it's interesting to read that footnote 62.
Yeah, yeah. Obviously,
If, yeah.
if scholars who have devoted their lifetimes to this sort of question can't agree, we can't expect to resolve it either. But
I don't know why
it's
we're not going to read it. Why are we not going to read it?
I'm sorry.
Are we going to read the note? I think it would be worthwhile.
I'm not sure if
Well,
Mikasa-
if you want, we could quickly. Do you want to do that, Robert, for 5 minutes? Or
Why
I
not?
think it's a bit deep in the weeds, so maybe it's more efficient for individuals who are interested in that to read it, because it's interesting but tangential to the main thought, I think, of Spinoza. Given the time limitation, I would just push on.
you take it up next week, Robert, if you think it's really important.
Okay.
All right. So what's the point of all this? One of the point actually is the notion of truth. Yeah, and he obviously at his time the predominant notion of truth is the correspondence theory. And here actually he is referring to, instead of external correspondence, internal consistency. And for truth, for Spinoza, a clearness and distinctness as internal criteria, very important. And then obviously adequate ideas for him are clear and distinct ideas, and sometimes he would say immediate, because for axioms, it need to be immediate. We need to immediately grasp it for axiom, for common notions. And then because of that, Spinoza actually often used true in place of adequate. So adequate ideas for him is true ideas. True ideas are adequate ideas. So they are interchangeable. So when we talk about common notion being adequate, we're really saying they are true. That's the real point. All right. So that is, I guess, a brief overview of common notion, what they mean, and what are the implications of it. Let's move on to the next layer of common notion, which are the logical derivatives. This is my usage, derivatives. But I think he used some other words, implications or consequences. Whatever, so this is in P40. Whatever ideas follow in the mind from ideas that are adequate in the mind are also adequate. So this sounds commonsensical, but let's dive into the details to explicate what is meant by follow in the mind from. He actually means a syllogism. That's really what he meant. And I find the following classification really interesting for me because it puts everything together. Dialectic syllogism are based on generally known opinions. Of course, as we go through this, keep in mind that the structure of his three kinds of knowledge. In the first kind, from senses, opinions. So if you use a syllogism in your argument, but based on opinions, even they are known, meaning widely accepted, you are engaging in dialectic syllogism. And but if you based on opinions that's accepted on certain authority, not generally known, well, you are engaging in rhetorical syllogism. Also, anthem. Well, if you use your arguments with the syllogism that's ill-founded, well, you are engaging in sophistic syllogism. But if you start with true premises, you are getting episteme, knowledge, true knowledge. So the three kinds of syllogisms and one kind of true knowledge. And this is what he meant when he says follow in the mind from. You are engaging in a mental process of logical syllogisms. So this is the conclusion from the scholium. Which notions are more useful than the others, and which are of hardly any use, which are common, which are clear and distinct only to those who have no prejudices, and finally, which are ill-founded. I was not able to understand this until I gone through the understanding of different types of syllogism to really appreciate what he was talking about in multiple words. All right, so then let's go back to the P40. So what he's really saying is that if we follow logically valid syllogism and start with the true premises, then we'll go from adequate ideas to adequate ideas. So if we start with adequate common notion, we will end up with adequate ideas, which are the derivatives, logically, of the common notion, the axioms we start with. Okay, so that's what he meant by those simple sentence. And so I thought that was quite interesting. Any questions? Otherwise, I move on to another topic. Yes, Chris.
That's more common. Like I really like this kind of support what I was talking about, where you want to get to the truth, but the only way you can get to the truth is like with the dictionary, you strike some kind of balance between how people commonly use language and how the experts find more precise definition that they're trying to enforce to be able to better, study things. But then the masses don't follow that. So you always have to strike that balance when you write a dictionary between the expert definitions and the common usage. And with this combined, we go out and make truth statement about the world, because like it really does fit with the Quinian perspective, I thought.
Yeah, that's interesting. So what I find interesting of the way that Spinoza is analyzing our mental process is that, by being particular, very meticulous of this different stages of thinking, he then can point out where we might go wrong. I think that's his aim, his agenda, and therefore, how are we going to live a better, flourishing life? All right. So the next topic is simple ideas. You may recall that I said there are different components at the very beginning for our rational reasoning process, and the common notion is a big part of it. But there's also other ideas that are adequate, simple ideas. So simple ideas is very important in his thinking. And here is P34. Every idea that in us is absolute or adequate and perfect is true. All right. So this absolute is a new term. What does he mean by that? And so let's say ideal absoluta, and it relates to simple idea, which means idea of a simple object. So simple idea are not superficial ideas, but they could be very complex, sophisticated ideas, but they refer to simple objects. And Aristotle has had a similar idea. The process of thinking indivisible whole belongs to a sphere from which falsehood is excluded, meaning we can never go wrong when we think about the whole. Falsehood, in fact, never arises except when notions are combined. So when we put together different various simple ideas, we make errors. Aquinas also said a similar thing. Falsity of the intellect is concerned with the composition of the intellect alone. Yeah? And Descartes, similarly, there can be no falsity save in that of the compounds made by the understanding itself. So all these guys were arguing that it's error-prone when we start to think in composites. But when we think in simple, indivisible whole, well, we don't make mistake. And so that's his exposition of simple ideas being adequate, being true. All right. If no questions, let's move on to the third component of his adequate knowledge, which is intuitive ideas. And intuitive ideas are actually ideas related to God. So this is, I mentioned at the beginning, it's difficult to grasp for me. So let's see. What is the ideas of God? The truth of which is not tested by the external standard of correspondence. So when we think of a God, we're not thinking about correspondence of that idea to some reality, do we? And God's existence not demonstrated cosmologically, even though some effort have been made in that direction, but it is more demonstrated ontologically, which means that it's in the very concept of God that we can demonstrate the existence of God. So we don't need to go outside the concept of God. It's all by itself internally. So that's the idea of God of Spinoza. And then what's this all ideas insofar as they related to the idea of God? He meant, I think this is from Wolfenson, a scholar, commentator of Spinoza, from another work of Spinoza. If we also suppose the intellect to deduce other perceptions legitimately from the first, all those thoughts will be true. Depends solely on the power and nature of the intellect. So if we think the ideas of God is true, and we derive other ideas related to the God, then the derived ideas must be true, according to this logic. And therefore, all ideas, insofar as they are related to God, are true. So intuitively, because we know the ideas of God, we know a lot of other stuff, as long as they are related to the idea of God. This is a bit striking for me, but that's what he said. That's what he said.
I wonder,
Yes.
Nick, reading this, if it occurred to you, do you remember the peripatetic axiom that the scholastics had this formulation that what is now in the intellect was first in the senses. When they say peripatetic, it must be in Aristotle as well. So the tradition holds that ultimately all of our knowledge must be derived from our experience, but there seems to be a strain in Spinoza which says that our knowledge can operate entirely within the attribute of thought without having to refer to the attribute of extension. You know, when he says you can get from God solely through, to particular things, solely through the power and the nature of the intellect, without appealing to the senses at all. It's a very striking feature of his thought, and well, it takes a bit of getting used to, but he really does seem to set a lot of store by this internal criterion of truth. You know, the idea that the mind knows a true idea when it sees a true idea without having to check the correspondence between the idea and the object of the idea. Yeah.
Can I just quickly point out here, you know, in Proposition 32, when it reads, all ideas insofar as they are related to God are true, that could be a better way of putting it would be simply say all ideas insofar as they are in God are true. And that's because in Proposition 32, what we're talking about is all of the ideas under the attribute of thought, of course, that are in God are necessarily true.
Yeah,
The world is God. God has an attribute of thought for every singular object or any phenomenon whatsoever in the world. There is an idea representing that, and it is of necessity true because, of course, God's is infinite as the world is infinite and eternal. And so he has all the information. It couldn't possibly be an error. Moreover, there is nothing outside of the infinite intellect of God. And so there's, you know, there's no way that there's something that God could not know. Our own thoughts and ideas are grossly limited, right? We just can only think, we only have ideas to the extent that we are extended in space, right? Our body is the parameter. Our body is, as far as we can think, as far as our body extends, that's how far we can think. God, there are no limitations. So therefore, all of God's ideas are true. So that's really just a statement about the nature of
that seems to be what he's saying in the demonstration of Proposition 34 as well. Remember, Proposition 34 says that every idea which in us is adequate is true. And the proof just says that if we have an adequate idea, it's God's idea. And if it's God's idea, it's true. And that's it.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, like, you know, you have a true idea. That's because your mind is in God anyway, right? So your entire mind is in God. So
I think didn't Gelom wrote a book about Spinoza and psychoanalyzed him, and I think in that book he says that maybe these statements, while technically true, we shouldn't read too much into, because he needed to get along with his Jewish community, and he needed to put some of these statements in to even get his book read and not get thrown out of the community. And so while these technically is true, Spinoza might not have thought this was very profound either.
No. Chris, let me tell you something. I don't think that there was ever a philosopher with as much integrity as Spinoza. He would not say anything to appease anybody other than what he recognized to be true. You know, that's just nonsense. When Spinoza talks about God, he's talking about nature, and he's describing nature according to his rational understanding, and he wouldn't care less what any theologian or the religious community of the Jewish community or anybody else would think. He just couldn't care less. He just wrote the truth. So there was never any way, you should never ever be misled by this notion that Spinoza is making qualifications on behalf of somebody or you know, it's the political or religious order of the day. None of these things are ever true of Spinoza.
If you think about the previous slide where he said that you have to include how the common person uses this term, so he's obviously trying to fit his philosophy into what people have said before. And if you define God like nature, then he can refer to the things they talk about in the Bible and kind of make a bridge between the two. So I still think that maybe he's doing it to fit in somehow.
He
Rather
wrote
than he believes God is the most important concept. by itself.
Yeah, but you don't have to read very far into the ethics before you realize that we're not talking about anything like a conventional God, a supernatural God, or a transcendent God. None of those things are true. A personal God, none of those things are true of Spinoza's God. I, for the life of me, don't understand why he ever used the word God. He should have just used the word nature. Then he would have, saved a lot of grief in terms of the commentary, because it's quite clear if you read on God, the first part of the ethics, that he's not talking about anything except reality or the world, not anything that transcends the world or in any ways can be distinguished from the world. It's simply the world. And I really, if you were to read the theological political treatise, you would see that Spinoza was not going to modify or qualify or make any kind of appeal to what was traditionally understood by the concept of God. That just never, ever happened in Spinoza. It's one of the most admirable things about him. He was just unrelenting in his determination to express the truth. And all those traditional gods, the Jewish, the Christian, all that stuff, even the classical notions of the divine, for Spinoza, there's nothing supernatural in the world. Nothing is supernatural in the world at all. So that's really what you should, don't take my word for it. Read the theological political treatise and you'll see it's quite astonishing, the things that he says in that book. And of course, as soon as it was even published, then it was condemned and he was censored. He wasn't allowed to publish the ethics. He didn't bother publishing the ethics. He just distributed the manuscript amongst his friends. But quite clearly it would never be published after the treatise, because he had already, even in a secular state like Holland at the time, there was practically no censorship whatsoever. But they had to make an exception for Spinoza because he offended everybody, and he made it quite explicit that everyone, this notion that God that everyone's been worshiping for centuries, it's just a complete delusion. And sorry for the rant. Go ahead, Courtney.
I was actually thinking something along those same lines, because one of the things that sticks out to me about Spinoza's life was his excommunication. And I tend to think that the reason he was excommunicated is because the religious institutions at the time realized that his God wasn't really a God of control. You couldn't use Spinoza's God to give people any false reassurances about events or outcomes, because with Spinoza's God, if your God was grounded in the idea that it was out to protect you or your group or your life or even life in general, what you did was you just boxed the idea of God. And according to Spinoza, that could never be a God, could never be the God. And you're right. I think he should have used the term nature more often, just like sometimes I don't think, a lot of philosophers think about the choice of words that they use, which is ironic to say, because philosophy really is a lot about the words you use and the terminology you use. But in Spinoza's case, I do kind of give him some leeway, though, because I kind of look at it like, if he didn't say God, maybe he wouldn't have got to finish the ethics, because heresy was a big deal back then. And when I heard that he got excommunicated, I was like, wow, how did he survive?
Yeah, but he wasn't excommunicated. He was excommunicated. He was banished from the Jewish religious community in Holland, right? And it was because he was already had a reputation for having heretical views. This was long before the political treatise was published, and the theological treatise was published. And there is a lot of mystery around that. But let's just put it this way. Okay, after the theological political treatise had been published, he would have been banished and excommunicated from he would have been crucified by anyone with any religious pretensions of any kind at that time in Western Europe.
Why do you think he survived? Like seriously, at that time in Europe, why do you think a prominent figure, someone who the church knew about, survives saying heretical things like this?
Because he lived in
That-
Holland. That was probably the
That's
most
it.
important thing.
Yeah, that's
Living in
exactly
Holland
it.
at that time was,
Yeah.
you know, it was the only place you could get away with it. And it was an extraordinarily civilized state, Holland at that time. And the government was entirely secular. There was, of course, a lot of powerful religious people involved and influential in the government, but it was a secular state. And so it was like living in America, you know, or Canada, or wherever you happen to live, if you happen to be living in a free state. And you know, you can just say what you free speech. That's really free speech prevailed in Holland at that time, which is quite remarkable when you think about it so early. Go ahead, Alex.
I had a question about Proposition 32. I don't really understand something about it. I guess I'm struggling with this idea of like an idea being in God. So we talked about how universals are inadequate ideas. Like my understanding of a horse is based on a limited number of examples of horses and is not a complete notion of a horse. But like, I'm a real person. I'm thinking about a horse. I'm in nature, and nature is God. So isn't that idea in God?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is.
Isn't that like an inadequate idea, though?
Yeah,
That
it
part
is
I don't get.
interesting. That's an interesting point, actually. You know, it's a very interesting point because you see, God knows your mind is a moment in the mind of God, right? God
Sure.
is an eternal mind and an infinite mind. So therefore, he knows everything about every individual horse that has ever been, right? He knows horses because he knows every horse that has ever been. And you form a universal form of a horse, and you say the horse. Everyone knows what I mean by a horse. You know, you're referring to a universal horse, right? The
Yeah.
universal form of a horse. But Spinoza's God would be looking down at you and go, "Oh, look at this poor deluded little human being. He
Right.
thinks he knows what a horse is, but I know that his idea is inadequate. I know because I know all the actual individual instances of horses that have ever been, right? Or will ever be." And so he recognizes that you have a universal that represents for you something that you distribute as a concept over a multitude of individual horses and think that, you know, it is true, but it's not absolutely true because there is no form that would cover adequately all the individual horses that have ever been, right? But God knows you have an inadequate idea, but you don't know you have an inadequate idea because, of course, even if you do know you have an inadequate idea, you're going to say, "My God, what do you want me to do? Make a record of every single individual horse I've ever had and never vary away from the effect that those horses have had on my body and the idea that's formed in my mind, you know?" So really all for the important thing to remember here is that for Spinoza, universals is not like it's not like a bad thing per se. It's only bad when you start treating universals like the universal horse or a universal man as being a real being that you can actually use in a rational argument and offer it as, you know, try to provide a definition or a proof, or, you know, you can't mix up the use of universal terms because clearly we need them, right? Otherwise, you couldn't talk about anything. You know, if there were more than one object of a kind in the world, you wouldn't be able to talk about them. You know, but you just can't use them in rational discourse and pretend to be proving anything in terms of philosophical doctrine or you know, theological doctrine as well, by resorting to universals and treating them as actual beings in the world. So but let me add something. I want to caution everybody, for everyone who's interested in this sort of thing, okay, I'm going to do a presentation next week, and I'm going to show that universals is it's a problematic concept in Spinoza's world. It's not like he just said, universals, they're absurd, and tossed them out. It's not quite as simple as that. It's really quite a fascinating thing to delve into. But again, I think the most important thing to recognize here is that common notions are something entirely different from universals.
Okay.
I think we should let Nick move on because there's a couple of other propositions that we need to
Okay,
get
let's
through.
very quickly ask what James
Yeah.
has to say. Let's very quickly.
Yeah, it sounds like, Robert, in your explanation that in order for us to have a common notion, that, instead of relying on universals, and from our perspective, from our point of view, universals would be inadequate. So we'd have to rely on the eternal idea of God in order to realize the common notion, in the world, because we can't rely on universals.
Yeah, well, in a way, this is quite simply a difference between, you see, maybe I just better let Nick continue with his, just remember one thing that's really important, and that is common notions and universals are not the same thing at all.
Right, that's exactly what I'm saying. That
I didn't realize
yeah.
this was.
In other words, the we call them universals, right? But in order to realize a real common notion, we have to rely on something like like the absolute idea of God, because he represents the eternality, in place of universals. So instead of universals, we have to rely on the infinite absolute of God in order to, actualize what we would, call the inadequate idea, the adequate idea of a common notion.
A common notion, I would just quite simply say this, just by way of example. I'm sorry I'm holding things up here. You know how everyone recognizes the geometrical form of a triangle, and that certain properties belong to triangles, and there's no way that we can misunderstand how a triangle has certain properties, and everyone knows they're true. Everyone knows what the form of the triangle is. It's a concept that we form very easily. That's a common notion, but it has a rational form. A triangle, in a sense, is a rational form, whereas a universal, I really just do believe that when Spinoza is talking about universals, he's just saying, look, there is not a universal form of red in the world somewhere. There is not a universal form of horse in the world, or man. He's just talking about universals in that sense, because the earlier scholastic philosophers, and anyone who subscribes to the universals, like, let's just say Plato, okay? Plato has been ridiculed for his idea of the forms throughout. I mean, it began with his first student, Aristotle. He said, this doesn't even make sense. What the hell is he talking about? For Plato, universal forms, the forms had more reality than the actual instances of those forms in the world. It had more reality. So, the thing is absurd, universals on the face of it. But they're actually essential for thought, and it's impossible for human beings to get through life without employing universals, just as long as we don't use them in rational thought. That's all.
But if you're just restricting the common notion to something like an object in the world without any kind of form, right? Without any sense of a universal, or let's say universals are, like you're saying, are inadequate, but you have to rely on something to give form to the actual things you see in the world in terms of common notions. So you need something like, so that's where God comes in as the eternal form that gives some essence to the common notion. If you have a common notion, what does that mean? You just experience material reality without
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. A common concept is a better word to use. And
Right.
you sounded a lot like it sounds like what you're saying is a lot like Leibniz. You know, for Leibniz, there could not be truths of necessity without God's mind holding those truths, because
Well,
they
but
just
the
couldn't.
way, but the way you brought in God to answer the question from before sounds like you're doing that. You're bringing in God in order to replace what we understand to be universals. So the God provides the kind of essence of form to the reality of the material reality of the common notion. So it's like, the problem is that can you have a common notion, which is just a material substance without some kind of form? Right.
No,
So, so that's where if you're not going to have universals, then you have to have some kind of some essence, some essence of form to take its place.
you should come to the next meeting, because I delved into all of those things. I delve into all of those problems that arise, because it's a problem for every philosopher, the question of the status of universals, because in some respects, it's very difficult to understand how we could think at all without universals. So we better let Nick continue uninterrupted.
Yeah, no, that's that's quite all right. It's very interesting discussion. So the chat already anticipates some of the proposition I'm going to cover. But before I move there, just quickly to comment on the exchange, I think these all come together for me, starting with Patrick's comment that Spinoza seems to have two streams of thought, one related to the extension attributes of God, and there, the concept of common notion, etc., and then the intuitive idea, the idea of God. And I guess for me, and of course Jim's question, and also Alex C's question, how do we take his conceptualization of the ideas of God? And I mean, these would be problematic for me if I were to take a Kantian view. Because Kant would say all of those rational theology stuff are really in the noumenal world, right? So they wouldn't interact with the phenomenal world. And therefore, we can think about God and the implication of our morality, what we ought to do. But there's really no basis for us to derive any laws or truths about them. But clearly, Spinoza took a very different approach. I think Patrick already mentioned, even when you look at the proof of P38, where he was talking about the common notion, even there, he had to resort to the idea of God in order to carry on the proof. So it's very clear Spinoza had to rely on this presupposition of the idea of God in order to have his system to work. Okay, well, take that presupposition, and let's move on to the last part of my presentation.
One very quick remark, Nick. You refer to it as a presupposition, but Spinoza has already, in the first part, demonstrated the existence of God and demonstrated that thought is an essential attribute of God, and that it is infinite in just in the same way that God is infinite. So therefore, there is that in a sense is not a presupposition. That's all I want to say. Okay, it's not a presupposition.
All right. So the Nick interpretation differs from Robert's interpretation. All right. So the last part of my presentation actually is already anticipated by some of the chats on the falsity. So I'm just going to share with you on the missing proposition 33 and 35 to 36. And to me, a very interesting detour on falsity, because that detour will help us understand better what is meant by him in saying adequate or true idea. All right. So 35. Falsity consists in the privation of knowledge which inadequate or mutilated and confused. Those two words. All right. What is the mutilated idea? The mind knows a whole or a complex only in part. Remember last week we talked about this. This is one of the fundamental argument for him to derive the conclusion that some of our ideas are inadequate because we don't grasp or conceive the whole. We only see complex totalities in parts. So that's what he meant when he referred to mutilated ideas. You know, ideas broken in parts, we can only grasp bits of them. So mutilated, you know, another term would be fragmentary. In Latin, I find it interesting, truncatus, truncated. So what are confused ideas? And these are the ideas that fail to distinguish, so we may fail to distinguish known from unknown. So if you remember, one of the Defense Department officials said about very interesting. I thought he must be very philosophical, wasn't he? All right, so
yeah,
maybe he read
Rumsfeld,
Spinoza. He may read Spinoza. So we fail to separate known and unknown, and sometimes the subtlety of the knowns and subtlety of the unknowns, the different types of knowns and unknowns. So we get confused. So that's what Spinoza means. Another kind of confusion is we confuse many things which are contained in each. I guess he meant individual object. So there are many aspects, a complexity of the situation. So we confuse them. So that would give a rise to confused ideas. Not because each individual idea is wrong, but we just confuse them. All right. So, and then he gave examples, very interesting example to illustrate what he meant. And this is for the P35 scolia. When we look at the sun, we imagine it is about 200 feet away. But actually, it's 600 diameters of the Earth away. So it's very, very far away. But when we look at the sun, we say, oh, that's far away. But okay, so we implicitly assume it's not that far away. We nevertheless imagine it as near, meaning nearer than actually the distance is. Because why? Because we imagine the sun so near. Not because we don't know, we actually know. You know, if somebody wants to check out the actual measurement, we could. But because an affection on our body reacts to certain sensory signal upon seeing the sun. So this is one of the sort of the run-of-the-mill example many philosophers, starting with Aristotle, use to indicate the limitation of our sensibility, I guess. But that's one of the example to illustrate the mutilated idea. Right? We couldn't grasp the totality of the situation. Another example is more fundamental, delusion of freedom. Men are deceived in what they think themselves free. They say, of course, the human actions depend on the will, but all are ignorant of what the will is and how it moves the body. Those who boast of something else who feign seats and dwelling places of the soul usually provoke either ridicule or disgust. Spinoza could be quite nasty in his writing sometimes. So he projects a sort of a gentle image to me before I read his stuff. But his text sometimes could be quite nasty. Here he's attacking Descartes, basically.
That's
So
right.
Descartes,
That's right. And he savages Descartes on exactly this subject in the preface to Book 5. It's very entertaining to read. You look
Yes.
ahead, and yeah. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, he no longer is a gentle, a lens grinder reading philosophers to me now. He could make a good politician, nowadays, debating. All right. So, but what's the point? The point is that he used those examples to illustrate that the falsity comes about because we either have mutilated, fragmentary ideas, or we have confusions of complex ideas. All right. So
I think also, Nick, sorry, I just mentioned that there's also a subtext, I think, in these propositions where he is, if you like, taking issue with conventional theological doctrine that evil is supposedly just a privation of good. Supposedly there is nothing positive in evil. It's just the absence of good. He's sort of transposing that into his theory of knowledge, that there's nothing positive about falsity, in virtue of which a thing is false. Falsity is just the absence of the complete picture, which is, the picture in God's mind.
Yeah. All right. So the last proposition is 36. So summing up all this, I find this is a good leadway into P36. Ideas then are not false in themselves. They become false only as a result of there being merely a broken up fragment, or there being the outcome of a confused combination of simple ideas. All right, so that's just a summing up what the last page is saying. So therefore, he's P36. Inadequate and confused ideas follow with the same necessity as adequate or clear and distinct ideas. So there's nothing wrong with the ideas themselves. So under the process they follow are all necessity. I think that's all I have because I covered the comparison with the universals at the very beginning. Yeah, that's the end of my presentation. Yeah. Oh, I still have this. Oh yeah, so just a summary. I have this, the implication of this. Hey, I have more stuff. Oh, I myself got confused. Yeah, maybe just 2 minutes. Sorry, I myself got confused. I finished up earlier than the 2 slides. So there's another proposition is 33. 33 says there is nothing positive in ideas on account of which they are called false. And what is the meaning of this? Okay, so in the demonstration, he says there can be no falsity in ideas. So this is what I said earlier. The ideas themselves has nothing wrong with them. Because idea is the mode of God. So okay, this relates again to God. So what I call the presupposition, but Robert thought this was proved by some more fundamental premise. So and in God's thought there can be no falsity, right? Okay, so because that's the definition of God's thought. And this is very similar to the older ideas about Aquinas. Truth is said to exist in things by conformity to the divine intellect, God's intellect. Descartes also had a similar idea. Our errors cannot be imputed to God. We cannot blame God. I think in the chat there's some sentiment that we may be able to blame the God for the evils in this world. But no, the Descartes would say no, you can't do that. There's got to be something wrong with something else. So and then if in ideas there is something positive on account of which they are called false, then we must assume. Meaning, if there is something wrong in this world, we cannot blame God, so we must assume either the mind has the power and freedom to conceive false ideas, or falsity is caused directly by God. Okay, this is the blaming God bit. And Spinoza is denying the God's freedom to conceive ideas arbitrarily. So Aquinas and Descartes and all the others would deny the second bullet. Right? We cannot blame God. And Spinoza is denying the first bullet. We cannot allow mind to have the power to conceive ideas arbitrarily. Now, got to follow a valid syllogism and starting with a valid premise. So he's pushing back against Descartes' assertion that the principle of free will in a certain measure renders us like a God in making us masters of ourselves. So this is the battle cry of enlightenment, right? So individuals are liberalized. We are masters of ourselves. Spinoza is saying, no, our mind cannot think arbitrarily. And therefore, with the implication, we are not free. So this is really the heavy implications of his formulation of the theory of knowledge. That's really the end of my presentation.
This is not a very simple set of ideas, and I have to admit, it's not perfectly clear to me how intuition works, the third kind of knowledge works, but Patrick's going to deal with it at great length, 2 meetings from tonight. And so you shouldn't, no one should be concerned about whether or not they have a very clear understanding of it at this point. And also the emendation on the intellect is something that is an earlier work, but it's in a sense Spinoza's discourse on method, and it's quite, he treats it at greater length and in an easier prose, it's an easier read than the geometrical method. He puts it in ordinary prose style. So I'm gonna, for anyone who hasn't included their email, I'm gonna put this essay here in the chat. And this is an essay that I recommend everybody read for the meeting next. If you're going to attend the meeting next week and you want to be well prepared, that is an essay that is actually a gem of an essay. It's just a beautiful essay. It's lucid and very concise, and it covers all the ideas that I want to deal with. And I'm gonna be looking at other problems that arise with the notion of universals and essences. as well. But if you read that, it'll be a kind of a good introduction to what I'm going to be talking about for anyone who's interested. And so the floor is open. Anybody have any remarks they want to make now? Go ahead, Chris.
So I just wanted to try out, like, throughout this whole story, I keep hearing like that Spinoza somehow values separating knowledge into different domains, where he recognized that it's not, you can't have ideas that applies everywhere. You have to isolate your problem. And maybe the example with the sun is saying like, we're using the sun to figure out how to grow stuff, and we just need to know whether it's up or down. We don't need to know the distance. So that's why we're not aware of it, because it's not the problem we try to solve right now. Do you think Spinoza is initiating this kind of thinking of paradigm shifts, of different webs of beliefs, of different domains? Or he's completely unaware of this? Because I think in philosophy of science, it came a lot later, right? After Hegel, that's after Spinoza, isn't it? That these paradigm shifts, kind of explanations starting to emerge. Where
Oh,
you
yeah,
realize
a big shift with Kant, because everything that Kant objected to and his critique of pure reason was to demonstrate that dealing with things like universals and transcendental knowledge in general, the knowledge of God, things like that, were virtually impossible. For Spinoza, Kant would have it all wrong. Like, you just didn't know how to do it properly, but I've done it. I've demonstrated the existence of God, and I've demonstrated the nature of reality. And I don't care whether you think I can do that or not. I've already got my troops over the bridge. You can blow the bridge sky high for all I care. But anyway,
it feels like you
but
should get some credit for that kind of thinking, right? That we need to isolate the problem space in order to design a solution and, understand, like the way we do science, right? The way we design things in.
yeah, this is metaphysics, really. Even if you're talking about epistemology now, it's still metaphysical, in the position that Spinoza adopts. Courtney?
Yeah, I really enjoyed the discussion. It really strikes me the ideas that Spinoza has when you try to look at his terminology and the time period with a Christian, or any religious, like, especially Abrahamic faith, point of view. It's quite shocking for a person, I think, to try and wrap their head around the terminology, why Spinoza uses the word God instead of nature.
That's a good question. I've never understood that. For the life of me, I don't know why he did that.
I mean,
There's no,
I do understand why, because of the time. I mean, would your book have been read by people who, the majority of which, believe God is the creator of the universe and has placed them in its exact center? And I mean, if you use terminology like, well, nature is the ultimate underlying force of what reality is in that time period, I mean, do people take your book seriously?
I don't know. I mean, it wasn't very long after that people were writing who were strictly like Kant himself. He doesn't invoke God in the Critique of Pure Reason, or any of the critiques as far as I can remember.
It's like he's a prototype. It's like Spinoza is a prototype, and he brings in these concepts about God which scare the establishment, and like they lay a groundwork for ration and reason, because it can't be outside of, like, when Spinoza says like an adequate idea comes from an adequate knowledge or intuition of an attribute of God. Like it's kind of hard to argue, even if you're a religious person, that
Yeah,
God
but
would have encompassed nature. You know? I mean, it
yeah,
would have about, you know.
it's not like he's using the name of God as being kind of like, you know, the ultimate authority either, though. He always, you know, Spinoza always provides a proof. That's one thing that you hear me say relentlessly, and that is because it's true. He never really ever says, look, you have to understand that this is true because it is grounded in God, and therefore, oh, it's undeniable, it's grounded in God. It doesn't work that way, you know. He provides a proof. And but anyway, so
I
I
mean,
don't
I would say that we will come up against this question in Book 5, where Spinoza is really going to ramp up the religious rhetoric. And in my reading, Spinoza believed that he really had the goods which religious teachers promise. And he wanted to communicate that to a broader audience. So he shamelessly used religious rhetoric to that purpose. Because we'll see that Book 5 is just saturated with it. But of course, the religion that Spinoza advocated for was a religion of reason rather than a religion based on scripture. So
he's
we
truly a
will
philosopher.
undoubtedly come back to this question.
he's a very clever writer, because I found myself in opposition to what he was saying or writing, and then I would look further into it, and when I took this framework outside of, like I said, a Christian mindset, a Christian framework, it made sense, and my offense just melted away. It made sense. It's like when he talks about adequate knowledge, or like when when Nick was talking about adequate knowledge, and it's common, common knowledge. It's just something that it doesn't matter what you thought previously. Now that you've seen this in this particular framework, it works. It's very hard to deny. I think it's probably why the church excommunicated him like straight away when he was very young, because it's kind of like, it's kind of dangerous the way he can make you see reason and understand it to be almost as a supernatural thing.
Yeah, I agree with you entirely. To take Spinoza seriously involves overcoming an awful lot of opposition, but it becomes for some people, at least in my case, it becomes a sort of protracted engagement where you find more and more depth in what he has to say. It's not something, at least in my case, that I ever grew out of. I mean, I encountered Spinoza, I guess, about 30 years ago for the first time. You know, in that time period, came back to him periodically. Every few years, I would reread the Ethics. So Spinoza attracts that sort of engagement for well, some of us. Blake, for instance, I guess Blake, are you still there, Blake?
No, he's gone.
He's gone. Yeah.
You know, Spinoza's not all that peculiar. All the modernist philosophers, Descartes and Leibniz, they were all accused of employing they all were accused of having gods that represented. They were called philosopher gods, and they were rational explanations. Like in the case of Leibniz, you know, there's only one reason that he ever employs the notion of a god with freedom, and that was in God's freedom to choose the best of all possible worlds. Apart from that, everything that transpires in Leibniz's God transpires of necessity. In other words, Leibniz God doesn't have any freedom either. And of course, Spinoza's God has no freedom. And so when, these theologians were like, what are you talking about? No freedom, man. And, but when it got to Spinoza, when they were, you're saying there's nothing supernatural, it's all just nature, this is the way it is, no free will. That was just much too much for most theologians. Whereas Leibniz, he really did temper his thoughts a lot for the powers of the church. Not because he was afraid of them. That's something that's really exaggerated, this notion that all these poor philosophers were being tormented and tortured and crucified by the church. They just couldn't care less. But in the case of Leibniz, he really did, try to provide something like an explanation for the nature of the world based on the traditional God in the theodicy, not in the monadology. But in the case of Spinoza, he had no interest whatsoever. He was not interested in God or theology in the ethics. He was interested in reality and morality, or ethics, I guess I should say, or whatever that strange notion of morality that Spinoza has. That's what he's interested in. How to live a good life, but not God. Or theological concern, no theological concerns whatsoever in the ethic.
Speaking of Leibniz, but thinking a lot about something, I don't know if we discussed it here. I think there's a book on the Spinoza-Leibniz encounter. And
there is, yes, yeah.
Yeah, and I know Leibniz admired Spinoza quite a bit, as I understand, but also there was a kind of moment of, like, Leibniz was abhorred by Spinoza's philosophy, or at least certain aspects of his philosophy. And I've been trying to figure that out, because I notice, as I get into Spinoza, and maybe every time I read him, really, there is this sense of that something is going awry here, or maybe at least I have some prejudice or intuition that's having a reaction against what I'm reading. And I think we got part way to that. I mean, for me, when we were discussing the modal collapse.
That's precisely the problem that Leibniz had with Spinoza.
Right.
And he convinced himself that Spinoza's necessitarianism was wrong. He referred to it as a precipice. he definitely did not want to go there. Because of course it really is fundamentally at odds with Christian theology.
Yeah, and I guess
that book is very entertaining. It's called what's it called? The Courtier and the Heretic.
Right.
So the Courtier was Leibniz. He's represented as God's attorney, and the heretic was Spinoza. It's a very enjoyable read.
Well, I have the sense, I mean, today's discussion too is adding to that picture for me a bit, because, I guess it's the question of the reality of the false and the reality of evil, and how it does seem like in Spinoza, there really is no room for something like evil in a genuine sense.
That's right. There's no theological problem of evil for Spinoza. There is good and evil. We will see what he means by that later. But it's relative to an individual being.
Yeah, there's no absolute principle of evil. Again, that would be a universal that Spinoza would rail against. The notion that there was this absolute evil somewhere in the world would be like, what the hell does that even mean? It doesn't mean anything. Evil's only taken from the point of view of what we'll eventually get to, and that is impediments to human thriving, and passivity and a whole variety of other different things that come up.
I guess the intuition that someone might have is, thinking of, let's say, an egregious crime that somebody might witness, and to imagine that, or to think that, well, this too is in God. This too proceeds from God, but then of course God is an agency or a certain being, substance, that doesn't quite have that moral dimension, right, that we're expecting. I think that's, to me, that's, you know, part and parcel of that precipice that Leibniz may have been thinking.
Yes. Spinoza's conception of God doesn't comport at all with the God of the Abrahamic religions. The closest parallel I could see would be in the Bhagavad Gita. The Krishna of the Bhagavad Gita has an awful lot more in common with Spinoza's God than the God of Abraham.
Yeah, I mean, if you just think of God as nature, you would just say, well, there are crimes committed in the world, and that's just undeniable, and we recognize that they're crimes. We recognize they should be punished. Crimes should be punished, and all these things are true. But
specifically about the Bhagavad Gita, it's if you like, a sermon delivered by Krishna to a warrior, Arjuna, on the battlefield on the eve of a fratricidal civil war, where Krishna is telling Arjuna that it's his dharma to slaughter his cousins and brothers and so on. It's completely foreign to our, the notion of God that we would have inherited from the Christian religions, but it's a notion which hundreds of millions of Hindus find quite credible. Could I just, I have to leave soon, so just to take care of some housekeeping. Firstly, if you haven't sent me an email, please do so. And Robert, for next week's meeting, I expect you'll write up the agenda on the meetup page, and perhaps include a paragraph saying that if you want to join the group, send a direct message to one of the hosts. We don't want to exclude anybody who hasn't previously been with us from joining the group later on. If we're not going to publish the link on the meetup page, we have to provide some way that people can join the group later on. So the agenda then for the next 2 weeks is that Robert will discuss universals and essences and all the other things you want to discuss in the meeting next week. The meeting after that, I will take propositions 40 to 44 about the three kinds of knowledge, how we contrast them with each other, and that leaves about 5 propositions remaining in book 2. So anyone who would like to do that, please let us know, and we'll arrange that.
Yeah, and also, if I may quickly suggest to everyone that you really have to give the latter part of this part 2 a good read if you want to follow my presentation, because I'm not going to do an exposition of the text as Nick has been doing. I'm simply going to talk about the problems that arise, and so I'm going to take it for granted that everyone's read that. Again, I highly recommend the essay that I just put in the chat there. If you look at that essay, it's really I recommend it more than I can say. So that's, I guess, all there is to it.
Okay, so I'll have to say goodnight. So thanks a lot, Nick. It was a very good presentation. I hope you'll do another one in due course. And so I'll say goodnight.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. I hope it was, worth your time. And I hope everyone comes again next week.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks, Robert. Nick.
All right.
Everyone.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Have a good night. Now I'm gonna end the chat. Okay. Bye-bye.